right, so given it about 3 minutes, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to this session on delivering on the private cloud promise. My name is Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing for Morpheus Data. So a couple of housekeeping items or webinar logistics. Feel free to post any questions in the Q&A section. I'll run through those and we'll get them answered. Additionally, there will be a recording of the webinar that will be made available after the webinar is completed. So the private cloud promise, it's definitely been the long sought after dream by many organizations. If we look at the NIST definition of cloud computing, we start to talk about really 5 key criteria areas. We're really going to focus on 4. So on-demand self-service, resource pooling, rapid elasticity, and measured service are kind of the key aspects of the definition of cloud computing. And so if we look at on-demand self-service, especially when we compare private cloud to the public cloud, we look at an AWS, an Azure, a GCP, the list goes on and on of public clouds. We start to talk about the ability of, oftentimes we correlate it to being able to take your credit card, proverbially swipe the credit card, and then voila, you get IT services. The challenge has traditionally been, how do I deliver a similar experience in my private cloud? We look at resource pooling, the idea of being able to take sort of massive amounts of compute and storage and memory and be able to pool that together to create sort of this cohesive nirvana of resources has always been challenging. From an on-prem perspective, there's a lot of really great technologies that have been introduced lately. From whether it's like composable hardware, the idea of being able to sort of mix and match resources and capabilities is really advanced in the last number of years. We look at rapid elasticity. And so rapid elasticity, for those that aren't aware of kind of the term of elasticity, it's the idea of being able to just scale out or scale up potentially, and then scale back down. Generally, we refer to scale out in terms of a workload. So if I have a web server, can I add 3 more web servers to meet demand? And then once there's no longer demand for 3 web servers, how can I scale back down to 1 web server? Then looking at things like measured service. So the common reference for this often becomes utility providers. So for things like electricity and natural gas, how can I be able to identify or correlate a price or a cost to a given IT service? So oftentimes in the cloud reference, it's for an EC2 instance. How much does that cost per hour? How much does an S3 bucket or RDS database cost per hour? And that's where we start to think of, how can I meter or measure the actual consumption and usage of the service from a cost perspective. And so those are kind of the 4 key areas that we'll sort of focus in on when we start to talk about the private cloud. For those that have looked to deliver on the private cloud promise before, there are a number of pitfalls and a number of issues that are often encountered as part of that process. And we'll walk through some of those as we go along. So delivering on private cloud, how can I actually deliver on the promise? As I mentioned, it's long been sought after as something that organizations will look to harness to deliver a public cloud-like experience, especially now on-prem, as developers and even business users have gotten a taste of the public cloud. It's now sort of ratcheted up that demand for the experience of a private cloud. So if we got to take a common scenario, we look at VMware Cloud Foundation, or VCF, sort of the reference architecture and implementation of kind of the suite of private cloud capabilities offered by VMware. So kind of the first piece when we start to talk about private cloud is server hardware. Generally, I have to have some compute and some memory and some storage capability. Whether it's done through something like an HPE Synergy or Dell EMC VxRail or Cisco UCS, I have to have some sort of hardware. And part of that lends itself to how can I deliver that resource pooling in a way is being able to use the best of the hardware to deliver the capability that's necessary. Then we start to layer on things like vSphere, vSAN, NSX to deliver the capability of how we could actually consume that hardware in a meaningful manner as it relates to things like virtual machines. Add the SDDC manager to kind of manage the whole aspect of it. Then we add in more of the operations aspects of things like VROPS, VRNI, VRLI, vRealize Lock Insight. And then we kind of, that gets bundled up into what we would typically think as the VCF. And so that we have our hardware, we have our VCF stack of resources or products and suites of capabilities. And then for me, it's, we layer on Morpheus, because a lot of the pieces were that self-service on demand. It was the elasticity in terms of aspects of actually sort of delivering on that private cloud promise. It's one thing to have vSphere, but the challenge becomes, well, we're not going to give everyone access to vSphere to go and sort of do their jobs. And of course, from a permissions perspective, that becomes very, very challenging very quickly for those that have ever gone down that path of giving, let's say, a developer access to vCenter. And so how can we sort of abstract this pool of capabilities and sort of turn it into that true private cloud from a capability standpoint for our organization? So that's where we look at Morpheus. So the Morpheus Cloud Management Platform, or CMP, looks to deliver that capability. And so how can we enable self-service private cloud consumption? Start with clouds. In this particular case, we're focused on private cloud and specifically on vSphere. But one of the things that's really powerful about the Morpheus platform is the breadth of support for clouds, whether it's vSphere, Nutanix, OpenStack, AWS, Azure, GCP. The list goes on and on. I believe we're at 20 plus, if not more, in terms of cloud support. And then we layer on top of that from a capability standpoint. We look at things like workload lifecycle management. And so this is being able, in the case of vSphere, is how can I manage the entire lifecycle of a virtual machine in kind of, as we mentioned, that self-service on-demand fashion as part of what we do as a core component of the platform. The next big thing for me is automation and orchestration, which ties into the workload lifecycle management, but it provides capabilities outside of the workload lifecycle management that we'll dig into. And then we've got costing and analytics. So we talked about that metered or measured service capability. And so how can we effectively associate a price point with a given resource provisioned through the platform? And then for me, it's that platform consumption of how can I deliver that on-demand self-service? It's, as I mentioned, we have vCenter, we have the web client to be able to access and manage our vSphere. But that's not the place where we want everybody to be in trying to provision and consume the workloads that they provision. It's just not meant for that. And the other thing also for me becomes, even outside of the web UIs and the capabilities there, we start to talk about API CLI from a consumption standpoint. And for me, that's honestly probably the biggest thing that we look at with the public cloud in terms of consumption is ease of use, where most organizations have started down the path of, yes, we will do some things in dev where users are accessing the AWS console. But once we get to production, oftentimes it's a scenario where we're not going to allow everyone access into the production environment from a console perspective. You're going to do it from via the API CLI, whether it's a tool like CloudFormation or HashiCorp Terraform, infrastructure as code tools. And for me, being I have that sort of that best of both worlds, and we start to look at even consumption of a self-service catalog as much simpler, and even being able to do that for public cloud in a scenario where you're not granting everyone access to the AWS console. And then the other piece for me becomes platform security. Yes, it's great that we have all these capabilities, but how can we deliver that in enterprise scale when we start to talk about things like sort of the table stakes for an enterprise software product is things like SSO or single sign-on. For us, multi-tenancy is a really big piece of what we do, and being able to, as one of the criteria of cloud computing was that piece where we talked about resource pooling, be able to take those, that big pool of resources and divvy it up at an even granular level when we start to talk about multi-tenancy. Role-based access control for me is a really big one, is how can we deliver on the sort of the promise or the idea of least privilege in a way that's actually meaningful. That's one of the biggest things for me about the Morpheus platform is the really granular role-based access control to be able to sort of divvy up of which catalog items an individual user has access to. Things to that level. And then for me, audit logging is another big one of being able to get visibility into all the operations performed, especially with the Morpheus platform touching so many different things. It's great to have that information there. So let's take a look at private cloud consumption. I mean, walk through the API, the CLI, the UI. And here's a picture or a screenshot of our service catalog. And so it's the idea of sort of you go on to Amazon or a Walmart, whatever the site may be, and you go and add an item to your cart, and then you click checkout, and then sort of you'll wait 2 or 3 days, whatever it might be. In the case of Amazon, it might be same day, and then your item shows up. So kind of that same experience with IT resources. How can I request, let's say, a single OS instance or even a complex multi-tier application as part of what I want to consume? I want to request that and be able to sort of go on my merry way. And that's as we mentioned, the idea of self-service, on-demand self-service, of just being able to go in and request that without the actual interaction of creating a help desk ticket and then waiting potentially, and then waiting even longer potentially just to get, let's say, an operating system of a CentOS or an Ubuntu that now 3 weeks later, I can then start to develop against or do my work against. And that's long been the challenge of especially private cloud and internal IT environments, is how can I deliver services at the speed and on demand, sort of being able to compare it to the on-demand aspects of the public cloud. And so that's where we come in with Morpheus. So as I mentioned, service catalog, power user GUI. And so for those that are potentially more adept at sort of navigating the pieces that they need, there's power user GUI, full fidelity API and CLI, and ITSM integration. And so you might say, yes, this service catalog looks great, but my organization has a requirement for, let's say, something like a ServiceNow to front end all of my IT requests. So there is a Morpheus ServiceNow plugin that simplifies the integration between ServiceNow as well as Morpheus. And so once again, talking about that on-demand self-service consumption of the platform and the resources, you can add that. And what happens is resources or catalog items within Morpheus are dynamically added into ServiceNow. And we can integrate with the approval workflow process as well for the request of the items. And so what that really does is for those organizations that are requiring ServiceNow to essentially front end all of their IT requests, this makes it super simple to where you can effectively just slide it right in to existing business processes for the request, as well as just how the business wants to consume various resources, whether they're very IT centric or just broader business. For me, that's always one of the big things when you look at a solution, is how seamlessly, in a lot of ways, can it slide into what my organization wants to do and already does from a business process perspective. All right, so we talked about the self-service consumption piece. Now we're talking about the workload lifecycle management. So you've given me a place and a way to be able to consume resources. Now, what resources can I actually consume? So in Morpheus, we have things like single OS instances. So let's say you need to provide Ubuntu or CentOS or a Windows box, or even this could be a single component of a broader application stack. So maybe I just need a MySQL server or a Tomcat server, being able to provide that. Complex application stack. So something like an Nginx, Python, Flask, application server, and MySQL, they're all tied together, and I request our application stack to start doing some development. That could be included. One of the other things that we're definitely investing heavily in is Kubernetes. And so how can I spin up a Kubernetes cluster on demand or deploy an application into a Kubernetes environment? So we start to talk about lifecycle management. That includes the provisioning, but it also includes sort of that day 2 management, as well as the sort of the back end process when a workload is no longer necessary. How can I do the decommissioning appropriately and aligned with what my organization needs from a decom perspective. And so if we look at on-demand self-service workloads in a traditional VMware vSphere environment, it's, yes, I go into vCenter, I provision a virtual machine as an administrator, and now I've got a VM, which is great for, let's say, a dev, a home lab. But when we start talking about enterprise environments, we've got several different pieces that have to go in. For some, there may be the case of a run book or a list of things that have to be done for production workloads. The challenge often becomes some of those lists, you're talking about 60, 70, maybe 80 or more different steps or touch points that have to go into place. Oftentimes I've seen where it's screenshot after screenshot after screenshot of go in and configure this and perform the validation based upon what's necessary, where organizations have issues with the quality and the consistency of what is being delivered, let's say to an application team, becomes sort of the problem. And so the challenge is, as an IT organization, how can we ensure that we're delivering a system that has been configured to the certain specifications that have been requested in an automated fashion that feels as though it's on demand, to where it's not the requester makes the request and then 7, 8, 9 weeks later they get their workload. The other challenge becomes, as we see on this picture, sort of that simplicity and ease of use oftentimes becomes a challenge on the administrator. If they don't have an existing CMP, or there is complexity inherently in the platform that they're using. And the challenge often becomes with rolling out private cloud solutions is, as I mentioned, the promise of it oftentimes sort of fades away, where time to implement the solution becomes a tedious project, to where you may have purchased the solution and now it's several weeks later where you're starting to really potentially start to get some use out of it. And for me, that becomes a problem when we start to talk about time to value, is how can I roll out a solution and start to get sort of immediate impact and benefit from the solution? That's where we really focus in on in terms of time to value with the Morpheus platform. So we look at the handful of integrations or touch points here. This is just I'm sure a small subset of a lot of the various integrations that many environments have as a whole. And so if we look at sort of that more linear process of, I need to provision a virtual machine. I need to reserve an IP address in the IPAM system. Could be something like InfoBlocks. I need to create a DNS record in DNS. Then I need to integrate with Ansible to configure the system as according to the specifications of what was requested, and then create a CMDB record for the actual provision workload. So these are just 5 steps. Most of you may have, like as I mentioned, potentially 60, 70 various different steps that need to be accomplished. And so for me, the big thing is, how can I orchestrate those in a fashion that's seamless, but also really simple? Because I've done orchestration and automation for a very long time. And oftentimes one of the challenges is how do I avoid it becoming sort of this Rube Goldberg device, or a scenario where there's thousands of sort of different touch points, and at the end of the day, it feels like it's spaghetti code, just trying to hold things together. And if all of a sudden I need to swap out my IPAM solution, you can almost forget the idea of me being able to integrate that seamlessly without ripping and replacing my various different integrations and touch points, and how the code is sort of cobbled together. So that always becomes the challenge of sort of the build versus buy. But even some of the different solutions that I've seen is, what's that ease of use of being able to integrate with various different integrations, but also to be able to swap out as necessary. Or even a scenario where I'm using them both side by side. So if we look at the IP address management, and one of the things I really want to highlight here is the first image, the screenshot at the top, add IPAM integration. So in Morpheus, there are 90+ out-of-the-box integrations with the various aspects of most IT environments. So if we look at IPAM, In this case, it's info blocks. I provide a name, I provide the URL, the API URL for the info blocks. I have the username, I have the password. There are a couple more fields that have been removed from the image, but in terms of just getting it going and integrated, that's it. And so I install the Morpheus platform, I go in, do some initial setup, and then I can go in and add an integration for the IPAM. And then it gets added, and then it starts laying out what we have from an IP address standpoint. So the lower image kind of shows pieces of the integration where, in this case, is my home lab where the second IP address in the subnet is being consumed. But for me, it's really time to value when we start talking about how can I get going quickly with a cloud management platform and it not take weeks and weeks and weeks to start to realize potentially some value, or you get to a scenario where it ends up being proverbial shelfware, where we purchase this really expensive product and we're not really using it, we're not getting the use we would think out of it, and not delivering on that private cloud promise. It often becomes the challenge. So in terms of IP address management, a number of other integrations we have here, Infoblocks, BlueCat, SolarWinds. We're also starting to build out our plugin architecture to where if there's a different IPAM solution, there's the possibility to be able to create that and add that as well. The thing I really want to touch on is that time to value. And we'll see that as a recurring theme as we go forward in the next handful of slides. And so, as we mentioned, we provision the VM. We need to integrate with the IPAM to grab an IP address. Then we look at DNS. So integrating and orchestrating DNS. Kind of as I mentioned, similar to the last slide, adding that DNS integration. Name, DNS server, username, password for an account into, in this case, our AD environment to interface with Microsoft DNS. Get that added as part of the process. Makes it super simple, super easy out of the box. We have a handful of other supported integrations for DNS, Microsoft DNS, Power DNS, AWS Route 53. And so now we've got the virtual machine, we've got the IP address management, we've got the DNS server integration. Configuration management. This is a big thing for me. So configuration management is near and dear to my heart. And oftentimes there's a lot of the pieces for configuration and automation of a system that goes into configuration management. So oftentimes it's the installation of agents, security agents, logging agents, various system configurations that are have to be aligned with from, let's say, a security or hardening perspective, as well as just a general system configuration of how the systems should look and how they should feel before they're delivered. So we start to get, especially a piece like this, when we talk about being able to deliver that on-demand self-service. This is a key one for me in terms of being able to deliver that repeatable and consistent look and feel of what, let's say, a production middleware machine should look like. So let's say we're installing Tomcat. What does a Tomcat server look like in my environment? These are all the things that have to be configured. This is how it's supposed to look and feel, so to speak. And how can I ensure that every time a user pushes the button within Morpheus, that they get exactly what they were supposed to get as part of the provisioning process. So oftentimes it's that configuration management piece. Right here, we're looking at the Ansible integration. Ansible is extremely popular open source automation orchestration tool. And we kind of, as this recurring theme, we integrate with, as I mentioned, 90 plus different integrations. So for us, it's how can we take advantage of best of breed capabilities and tooling, understanding that most large IT environments are a mix and match of various different tools and technologies. And so how can we, as my manager, Brad Parks, likes to mention, we're oftentimes self-leveling cement. So what that means is that how can we fill in those gaps of tying together all the various different tools and pieces within an environment to make it all feel like this one smooth sort of homogeneous environment or consumption model. So that's where we start really focusing on leveraging the supported integrations within the platform to simplify that. So in the case of the Ansible integration, it's in this case, leveraging oftentimes the way that sort of the DevOps, and I use that term sort of loosely. We think of DevOps in terms of consumption of how we handle things like configuration management and integration with various aspects of sort of CI/CD and the software process. And so code is stored in source control. In this particular example, so we're pulling the Ansible code from source control, directly integrated with source control. So the Morpheus platform reaches out to source control, pulls the code down, and then uses that to execute the plays, or the playbooks in this case, as part of the process. And so once again, so that time to value and speed is, you add the name, you add the Ansible configuration. There's a section under here that talks about how can I actually access the source control management. So token, private key for SSH key, there's the piece there, but that's really it. And then the integration shows us what plays it's detected, roles that it's detected. And the inventory piece is really big for me, is how can I simplify the inventory process? So in addition to Ansible and numbers, the integrations that we have here, one I actually forgot to mention or add to the list was Ansible Tower, is how can I simplify that bootstrap process, but also things like the inventory process with Ansible, so where it's really a seamless process. The last one is the CMDB integration of integrating with ServiceNow. So we saw the integration with ServiceNow sort of on the front end, and now this is on the back end, as well as with ServiceNow, Surewell, as well as Remedy, in terms of a CMDB integration, ITSM integration. So it is, once again, it is as simple as this, going into adding the integration for ServiceNow, adding the credentials, and then sort of away it goes. There's another piece where I just tie my CMDB to, let's say, a particular cloud that I've created or a group in Morpheus that I've created. And then once I provision the virtual machine, in this particular case, it goes off and creates the CMDB record. So really the focus has been with this is to walk me through that provisioning process of those 60, 70 different steps that need to be performed as part of the provisioning process, and then how we can simplify that. And as we walk through it, time to value is one of the biggest things for me. Is I've worked with a number of solutions to where it's you're doing a handful of coding, or you're jumping from UI to another UI, and you're trying to understand how those various different pieces connect, is often challenging. And the one thing we saw on the first slide, especially when we talk about VMware environments, is a number of you may have VRO in your environment for things like provisioning tasks. There is an integration with vRealize Orchestrator within Morpheus out of the box. So you go and add the integration for VRO, and you start to consume those various existing VRO workflows that you have within your environment. Also integrate with NSXT and NSXV to perform all the complex networking and firewalling integrations that you may have in your environment as well. So just definitely want to bring those up and mention those. And so we've walked through the provisioning process, great, but I also want to add in some governance. So it's great that we can tie into all these things, but now I need to make sure like my machines are, let's say, named appropriately. So somebody just doesn't pop in a name of test machine, which is often the case because naming is extremely hard for some reason to try and name things. And so there's in Morpheus, there are policies, what we term as policies. So that's a way to effectively enforce governance. And for me, I like to think of governance, not so much as telling people what they have to do and how they have to do it. But for me, especially with an on-demand self-service platform like Morpheus, it's I like to term it as a paved road. So there's a difference between a paved road and kind of the unpaved road. Generally, if you're driving your car, you would prefer to take the paved road because it's easier on the car. It feels more comfortable. And so that's what we can do from a self-service standpoint, provide that governance of this is a great way to go forward and consume resources. So instead of trying to skirt the system, you should just go along the paved road. So from a policy standpoint, we can assign policies in Morpheus to groups, clouds, roles, users to have various different compositions of of policy application. And so a handful of policies, the first one that comes to mind for me is virtual machine naming. Out of the box, there is the ability to create pretty complex virtual machine names and instance names, host names for the provision resources. So things like what the particular group that it's provisioned in, things like the environment that's provisioned, whether it's dev, prod, staging, the given cloud, various different pieces of metadata that can be utilized. So most organizations have kind of their common naming standard. Oftentimes it involves operating system name or operating the platform. So maybe like, let's say an L for Linux or a W for Windows. May include the environment, dev, prod, PRD, and then sort of a sequencing of numbers. One of the things is it's traditionally very difficult to do that quickly in a manual fashion, or maybe there's an extra plugin or an extra workflow that might be necessary, and various other solutions for just something like virtual machine naming, which makes it even more complex when we start to talk about rolling out the solution. And so built right into the product, virtual machine naming policies. So as we see here, it's a little small to see, but this one has user initials to uppercase, a prefixed piece of data, various. So for us, we can leverage a lot of various aspects of kind of JavaScript as part of creation of the virtual machine name. And so maximum cores, maximum memory, maximum storage, least duration, to be able to specify that, yes, you can request this particular resource, but after, let's say, 2 days or 7 days, it now needs to be consumed. And in a lot of ways, that's also where we start to talk about that sort of that elasticity to a degree. It's not typically where we refer to it, but when we start to think about the pool of resources, one of the challenges most organizations deal with is that VM sprawl of a virtual machine was created for a given use, and I'm sure everyone has a really good handle on that, but I've seen environments where virtual machine gets created and, like, let's say 2-3 years later, everybody's scratching their head wondering, well, what was this VM used for? Is it necessary anymore? And so being able to just easily reclaim that and add those resources back to the pool continues to go to that delivering of the private cloud. So we've provisioned the workload, and now how can we do those day 2 operations in a self-service fashion? When we start to talk about, let's say, things like monitoring and logging. So built into the platform is monitoring and logging capability of workloads. So let's say I'm a developer and I go and provision a virtual machine. And as part of that process, I can then, after I provision the virtual machine, I can go in and see my virtual machine and say, oh, and you know what? I'm using a lot of memory, or I'm using a lot of storage, or a lot of my CPU is being consumed. Maybe I should think about requesting a bigger or larger machine. Being able to have the insights of the network consumption, system logs right within the UI to be able to see what's going on. A lot of the challenge sometimes is being able to be given access to various different systems, or wanting to go through various different systems to get insights into what's going on with the machine. View install packages. This isn't to say that Morpheus is going to replace your monitoring and logging, but it's definitely a nice capability to be able to go into the platform itself and be able to see all these various different pieces as part of self-service consumption. Then we start to talk about sort of the more traditional day 2 operations of I've provisioned the workload. Now I need to do something with it, to adjust something, or I need to run something. This is one of the big ones for me, is how can I provide, let's say, certain tasks, let's say to my database administrator. They need to do this certain operation against the database pretty much all the time. How can we simplify that process, as well as make that consumable potentially by others? So maybe there's an operation that the DBA commonly runs, but maybe we would like to give our developers access to be able to run those particular operations in a potentially more self-service fashion. And so for me, that's where I start to think of this more as a sort of that self-service platform, to where we start to think more broadly in terms of how we can enable the organization. So we can do things like reconfiguring the virtual machine, as I mentioned, executing operational tasks and workflows, even accessing the system console within the Morpheus UI. The other piece I mentioned is those multi-tier applications. So we walked through sort of that single instance and kind of its life cycle, but for a lot of IT organizations, we just don't have a single app that sort of lives by itself, or a single virtual machine that lives by itself and doesn't talk to anything else and just goes on its merry way. We have complex application stacks that may be sort of the traditional 3-tier or some variation of different architectures. So in this particular screenshot, we have Tomcat and MySQL. So how can we define that in an easily consumable fashion to where it's not, user has to request the Tomcat server, then they have to request the MySQL server, and then somehow figure out how to tie them together. So within Morpheus, we have the construct of blueprints to be able to create complex multi-tier applications as part of consumption. So there's the option to, as we saw, the service catalog, to be able to consume the service catalog. The other thing for me is being able to lock in our nomenclature certain fields. So let's say I want certain aspects or certain pieces of metadata about the workloads to be potentially visible to the consumer, but not configurable, or maybe just not be visible at all, to where I want to consume the application stack, and all I need to know is 3 pieces of data. I enter those in and I click go or order in this particular case. And then let's say 15, 20 minutes later, I've got my application stack. I'm not concerned about, as a consumer, all of the sort of bells and whistles and where it's placed in a DRS cluster or in the vSphere cluster, or what storage it's on. I just want some highly performant storage, and I don't want to concern myself with all the low level details. I just want to consume and be able to go and do my job. So multi-tier application stacks, easily consumable with the Morpheus platform. And so we walked through kind of that whole provisioning piece. There's the decom piece, which, I mean, the various integrations that we have will be able to do a lot of that. Just go and clean up what I requested and I provisioned as part of the process. Well, let's dive into the private cloud operations. So one of the big, for me, I think we all realize advantages of public cloud is a lot of the managed aspects of sort of the underlying infrastructure. So whether it's I'm consuming IaaS or infrastructure as a service, or I'm consuming PaaS, platform as a service, there's the operations that are sort of magically done by a third party, whether it's AWS, GCP, or in that case, it'd be Google, or Microsoft in the case of Azure. So how can I, as an IT administrator, start to capitalize on some of the advantages of automation, orchestration, and the platform offerings within Morpheus to actually be able to kind of deliver at the speed and scale that's necessary to provide that rich experience. So for me, the automation orchestration capability within Morpheus is a great key component of being able to deliver the private cloud operations. When we start to talk about leveraging automation, so automation is the sort of the great equalizer of being able to deliver at scale. So how can I, as a single, let's say a single IT administrator, manage thousands of systems? So just a sort of a random number. That's generally with automation. Automation, consistency, kind of the 2 big aspects. And so with the Morpheus capability, tying into source control is a very big thing for us in terms of that's where the code should live. It can go through the CI/CD process in terms of, let's say, code validation, code testing, all those various aspects. And that's where we're gonna pull it from Git, to have that single source of truth, to have it version controlled with history, and as part of that process, change control, depending upon how the organization handles their Git. And then be able to leverage best of breed tools as part of automation orchestration. So whether it's PowerShell, it's Bash, it's Ansible, it's Chef, it's Puppet, it's Ansible Tower, being able to tap into those various aspects of automation for me is really big, especially in large IT organizations. I've seen a smattering of the different tools. It's usually never like our organization is going with, let's say, going with Puppet, or our organization is only going with Ansible. That's all we're ever going to use in our IT organization. it's often a hodgepodge of the different tools to meet the job that at hand. And so how can we as an organization start to centralize all of that capability into a single platform? And for me, that last bullet point is being able to deliver that self-service. So when we start to talk about self-service automation and orchestration, is being able to create complex workflows that accomplish IT operations tasks. Let's say it's even something as simple as going and clearing out logs from various different machines, or handling the reboot sequence of an upgrade. Things like that, being able to deliver it in a self-service fashion means it can be created and then it can be easily consumed by others within the IT ops, or even, let's say, broader IT organization, to actually consume those resources, and then potentially even extend outside of the IT organization into the broader business, to where I can start to deliver self-service things to the organization that aren't specifically IT related as it relates to IT operations. The other thing for me becomes you start to add in scheduled workflow execution or scheduled task execution. So those various different scheduled tasks or cron jobs that I may have on various different machines sprawled throughout the environment, I can now start to centralize those, start to get visibility into what my scheduled operations are, and be able to iterate on those to improve them. And then the other aspect we mentioned, kind of the three sections: the workload lifecycle management, the automation and orchestration, and then we get to the costing and analytics. And so one of the aspects was that metered service for the criteria of cloud computing. So discovery of brownfield resources is a great way to start to get visibility into what workloads are provisioned in the environment, start to get understanding of potentially are those workloads right-sized in terms of what their consumption is. So basically it's a plug in Morpheus, kind of connected to your vSphere environments, and away it goes, starting to discover the particular resources that are in the environment, start to get a hold on what's going on in the environment. Adding in the costing, so adding in the cloud prices effectively to the on-prem resources. So let's say the request of this application stack, you requested, let's say, a large. The cost associated with that is, let's say, $15 an hour, whatever it may be, to start to be able to get that visibility into the metering of the cost. Reporting, analyzing, and allocating cloud costs for showback. A lot of organizations would like to start to move into a showback model for their on-prem resources. The challenge has been, how can I do that? Sometimes with other platforms and other products, it may be an additional product or an additional component within the broader suite. And so when you start to do that, it adds in additional complexity, because now instead of just the platform for my provisioning, automation, orchestration, I now have to have another platform to be able to consume those cloud costs, and then have those two tucked together, which you would think would be pretty easy, but can be a little more challenging than it really should be. And so kind of as we start to wrap up, enterprise platform security. So for me, it's great we talked about all these various aspects of the platform and its capabilities. It can do a lot of really great things, but can I use that in my enterprise environment? For me, that's often the question of evaluation for, let's say, startup products and sort of net new products that I see come into the space. Yes, really looks great from what it can do, but can I really use this in an enterprise organization? Becomes the challenge. And so for me, single sign-on within the Morpheus platform, with providers like Okta, OneLogin, Azure AD, to be able to consume or integrate with those identity providers, be able to leverage the multi-factor authentication within those platforms, be able to leverage all the policies and security in place with those platforms, without sort of diverging and having to do that all again in a different platform, a different product, where they call things, or they name things differently and they call things differently. Really simplifies things. Role-based access control, as I mentioned, really granular role-based access control to be able to specify which user or which role can get access to a given catalog item, to a given cloud, get really granular there. Multi-tenancy for, especially for service providers, is be able to carve up that pool of resources to be able to say this subset of resources can be accessed by this customer. This subset of resources can be accessed by this customer as part of the process. And then we have auditing. So for me, as I mentioned, one of the big things is being able to track all the operations activity that's going on in the platform, especially as it's touching so many different aspects of an IT environment, is really important when we start talking about security and compliance. So for me, as we wrap up, and if there are any questions, please feel free to post any questions. Experience Morpheus is what I would say. So kind of along a matrix reference, choose the red pill and learn more about Morpheus. So Morpheus, we have the Morpheus Community Edition, where you can sort of get your hands on the platform and build your own private cloud. And see what the platform can do from a capability perspective, how easy it is to get started with the platform and consume it. And then also a Morpheus demo. So you can go right to our website, schedule a demo to walk through the Morpheus platform and see how it can help your organization. All right, well, that's what I have for today's webinar. As I mentioned, feel free to post any questions. I would love to tell more about the platform, more than I already have, I would say. All right, well, it looks like we don't have any questions. So I would say I appreciate everyone. Oh, you got something here. Let me take a look. Yeah, glad to give an overview of the platform and its capabilities. So well, I thank you all for your time. I'll give you back about I think we're at what, 10 minutes of your day. And thanks for joining.